My video is black. It's not showing up. That's weird. This is the interpreter, Heather. Let me, I guess, log out and log back in.
Okay. Okay. For those of us who have already joined, I would just like to say welcome. We will get started in a few minutes. We are waiting for our interpreter to also appear for those who may need it.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I'm having technical difficulties. It's showing that I'm on video, but it doesn't, like, the screen is up black. Okay, let me try it one more time.
Have you, before you log out,
Yeah.
have you tried checking your camera settings to make sure it's like going out to the right camera or it's not covered up?
It's not covered up, and I just had another Zoom meeting
Oh,
and
okay.
the camera was working. It's built into my Mac.
Oh, okay, okay.
So I'm not a guru or anything, but I've never had this problem. So, okay, hold on.
Sure. Look at that, audio and visual at the same time.
I had my kid run up and get my iPad. Uh-oh. Wait a second. There's pandemonium here. Shh. I can't find I had to restart. And so I don't know where can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
I don't know where my screen is on my computer. I'm so bad at life. I just I don't know where on my screen you are. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. And I can't even mute myself because I don't know where you are.
If you want, I believe I can.
Yes, mute me. And I'm looking for you. Where is this? Up, found it. That unplug it and replug it, that works.
Every time.
Oh, the wonders of technology. All right, so I do believe we have all of our panelists here, and hopefully that's given our participants time to sit down, cuddle up with a drink, enjoy, the great weather today. My name is Rita Porterfield. Today's presentation is Understanding Fair Housing During COVID-19. This webinar is specifically targeted for our landlords and housing providers so they can get a better picture of what it is that is protected under the law and how they can avoid liability and manage risk. Next slide, please. So April is Fair Housing Month for those of you that do not know. And again, what we do is try to enforce laws already on the books and propose improvements in legislation to help ensure fair housing. Fair housing is important because there hasn't always been equal access to the housing realm. Where we live, where we rent, where we own has been determined by inequalities for so long that have remnants and vestiges that affect us today. What you can expect to learn from us today are new issues in fair housing. The most common issues we see are disability related claims, especially emotional support animals and service animals, new protected classes, such as citizenship status, preferred language, and survivors of domestic violence, recognizing barriers to housing for people who have complex or diverse needs, and ways to increase access to your programs for diverse populations. Not only does that mitigate liability for you, that opens up your market share. And we'll also answer questions at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So 2 out of 4 of your presenters are the Commission on Human Relations, which again, I'm Rita Porterfield, the Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh, Fair Housing Partnership, and Mary Jane, could you please refresh me and plug your organization too?
Sure, no worries. My name is Mary Jane McCullough. I'm the founder and director of Global Wordsmiths, which is a language access advocacy organization in Pittsburgh with regard to working with individuals who might have emerging English proficiency.
And Ray, would you mind introducing yourself and Fair Housing Partnership?
Hey, my name is Raymond Moore. I'm the education and outreach coordinator with the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. We are a nonprofit organization that is part of the Fair Housing Initiative programs. We are actually funded by HUD, and our goal is to actually implement fair housing laws and regulations and making sure that they are enforced. That is our primary narrow window that we actually operate underneath. But we work very closely with the city commission.
Right. Your city commission is your enforcement, and FHP does help with a lot of testing and bringing of individual complaints or advocacy.
Exactly.
And lastly, Adrian, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and your organization.
Sure. Adrienne Lang, Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh, and we serve survivors of domestic violence. I'm the on-site services program manager, so I manage our emergency shelter, our 24-hour hotline, our children's advocacy program, and our rapid rehousing program.
All right. Well, with your presenters introduced, may I have the next slide, please? To describe the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, what we do is investigate complaints of discrimination in housing, employment, public accommodations, so stores, bars, things of that nature, city services or civil rights, including police complaints or other city services that may be provided to you as a citizen of the city. Again, for discrimination to occur, the action suffered by the complainant must be based on status in one or more protected classes. We'll get into protected classes later, but generally speaking, a protected class is an inextricable layer of one person's identity. We also provide outreach and education on fair housing and employment practices. Again, this is that outreach. Thank you for attending. And we provide policy review for housing providers. That is a free service that we offer as the commission. So if you have questions about, is my lease appropriate when it comes to discrimination? Are there changes I need to make? Are there forms available? Those are all things we can help provide and review. Next slide, please. So to get into protected class, and Ray, by all means, feel free to tag in. A protected class is a collection of an identity that a person has. They come in layers. So everyone has a race or a sex or a preferred language. Those are examples of protected classes. They're inextricable from who we are as a human, and yet they do not totally define us. For example, we are more than just our race, our sex, or our preferred language. When it comes to protected classes, there's both federal fair housing and the Pittsburgh City Code. Our agency enforces both. And if you don't mind, Ray, I'll do the Pittsburgh ones and you can do the federal ones, if that sounds good to you.
That sounds great.
All right. For Pittsburgh City Code, in addition to all of the Federal Fair Housing Act provisions, we cover place of birth and ancestry, so one's background that may or may not also overlap with national origin. We cover sexual orientation, gender identity, that is how a person identifies their gender, gender expression. Gender expression is the outward appearance of one's gender to others. For example, and they can be different. And the best example of that is there was a woman who was cisgender, identified as female. At her place of employment, there were uniforms for men and for women. And she did not wish to wear the dresses that had been prescribed for women. That fell under expression, but not identity or sex. Hair is a new added protection. So one's hairstyle, which can very often overlap with religion, national origin, or other identifiers or protected classes. Statuses of victim of domestic violence. They may also be called in the vernacular survivors of domestic violence.
Mhm.
The statute is a little bit dated and refers to survivors only as victims. But as a practical matter, we understand survivors and victims to be interchangeable words. Citizenship status and preferred language were also added in 2020. And while they can overlap with things like place of birth, ancestry, or national origin, they are distinct and separate.
All right, looking at the federal ones, the Fair Housing Partnership, since we operate in the state of Pennsylvania and also the city of Pittsburgh, we actually, our primary focus is on the federal ones that are actually listed, which are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. I'm actually going to explain national origin a little bit differently than ancestry. I know that you guys actually have a slide for that, but those are two different things. National origin is your place of birth, actually where you're born. So if you were actually born in Canada, you're Canadian. You're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. So that's actually your national origin. Whereas ancestry, and I know that Ree's actually covered, is a little bit different. I actually have an example for that, but I'll actually let her get on that because I know she has a whole slide based on that. If any of your violations that actually you're looking at or you're concerned about happen outside of the city of Pittsburgh, we are your advocate, both for in the city of Pittsburgh, working with the commission, but then once you actually leave the county and go out to other counties or other parts of the state, we actually can also assist you there as well too, because we actually operate not only in Allegheny County, but also the surrounding counties, going all the way down to Washington, all the way up to Erie, all the way over to Lackawanna. So if anything actually happens in one of those other counties, reach out to us. We're actually the starting point for that. And then we will actually work with either the local agency in that area, or we'll handle it all on our own.
So some things that are examples of illegal discrimination when these actions are taken based upon one's protected class. Refusing to rent or sell housing, refusing to negotiate with someone because of their protected class, making housing unavailable, setting different terms, conditions, or privileges for sale or rental, providing different services or different facilities to different people, falsely denying that housing is available, making, printing, or publishing discriminatory statements. This includes advertisements, using different qualification criteria for different persons, harassing a person, and this also includes sexual harassment, or allowing for harassment to be continued or perpetrated by others in an apartment complex or employees or contractors that you may work with, failing to maintain properly the dwelling, or delaying maintenance or repairs because of the protected class. Next slide, please. So there are certain exemptions, and I will let Ray talk about the federal exemptions if that's okay, and because there really aren't any in the city itself.
The federal exemptions, I know that there's the Miss Murphy law, which actually, if you actually are a landlord and you actually, live in the property itself, you can actually choose who your actual neighbor is going to be. But there are actually federal exemptions on that, where if you're living in a duplex, sure, you can actually choose. But then once you actually exceed that and you go to 4 units, and then that's actually where it actually changes. I believe it's for the city. You guys actually change at that level. But we actually do to give that exemption, what we call the Miss Murphy law. So if you are, you want to choose who your landlord, who your neighbor is, you're actually allowed to do that. But once you actually exceed a certain number of units, which I believe is 4, you can't do that in the city. When it comes to religious and organizational housing, if your church built houses and said that members of this church can live in these houses, then yes, you're actually allowed to do that. Now, if you were part of a church that it was a whole group of churches building houses throughout the entire city, no, you can't do that. But it's actually for that congregations, for that specific church, yes, you can actually do that. If your church is building housing for your members, then you can actually choose who actually lives in those units. And then when it comes to housing for seniors, yes, there's actually age restrictions on that. There's actually a 55 and over restriction, and then there's also 65 and over restriction, 62 and over restriction on that. When it's 62 and over, it actually has to be 100%. At 55 and over, the percentage is less than that. I believe it's 80%. I haven't actually covered that one in a while. To go through my notes, but I believe it's 80% on that when you're actually looking at 55 and over senior housing.
And if I may also add, the most common exemptions we see for religious or organizational housing would be parsonages or convents or rectories. We also know of examples where the home might be for members of a certain club. Elks is a good example. They have a home reserved only for Elks members. So that's not exactly housing open to the public and may fall under those federal exemptions. In Pittsburgh, anything beyond a duplex there is no such exemption under city code. So we actually do have more restrictions than the federal law. And it's important to know that if you are renting out a duplex, you still cannot discriminate. No. If you live in one side and rent the other, you still cannot discriminate or not rent to persons because of a protected class. Next slide, please. The most common complaint we get is disability. And a disability is defined as a physical or mental condition that substantially limits or impacts one or more major life activities for the person. Next. What we anticipate and what we have seen in certain circumstances is that COVID-19 tends to fall under disability protections, because very often someone who has contracted COVID are seen as having a disability just by record of the COVID contraction. So perception is also important to actually being a member of the protected class. Actual membership is not required if the perception is that one has a disability. So there are policies of both disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment is usually a comparison between how you treat one tenant versus another, and one tenant being of the protected class, say having a disability, versus the other who does not have a disability. Policies of disparate impact would include what seems to be a neutral or fair rule, but as it's applied, it tends to hurt those along protected classes. Such an example would be the COVID restriction we've seen: no visitors allowed in the apartment building. While that may seem fair and a positive measure to try and reduce the spread of COVID, not allowing for those with disabilities to have necessary aides come in or perform visits and services is disproportionately impacting those with disabilities. The reasonable accommodations and verifications. When a tenant comes to you and says, I would like a change, or can we negotiate a certain element either of the lease itself or in services provided to adjust for a person's disability, that is a reasonable accommodation. In no circumstance do they have to say the magic words, reasonable accommodation. As long as you, the landlord, have an idea that this need or this change or this request is related to disability, that should put you on notice that it is a reasonable accommodation situation. The process is called the interactive process. That means engaging with your tenant. I will tell you right now, if as an investigator, there's a complaint, I see the complainant has requested a reasonable accommodation or something that should be reasonably recognized as such, and the landlord refuses to discuss, that's an automatic finding of probable cause because they haven't engaged. So again, the more you can interact with your tenants, the more you mitigate your risk, the more you avoid liability with the commission. So verifying disability related needs. How do you know the request is related to the disability? Sometimes it's obvious. If you have a no pet policy, you have a person who is blind with a guide dog. You should know that that person needs that guide dog to have a reasonable shot at living an everyday life. When it might be appropriate is if you have a no pet policy and someone says, I have this animal who is a support animal for me. At that time, it might be appropriate to have more engagement and more inquiry. So what is third-party verification? I want to be very clear. There is no federal registry. There is no government sanctioned format of how one should have a certificate or licensing. And unfortunately, there are predatory third-party verifiers. The website that says, if you pay $50 to us, we'll make sure that you have a license. And just because someone has fallen victim to that does not mean that the animal they have is not still an emotional support animal. It does mean that you may need to do more investigation. So appropriate third-party verification could include doctors, but it doesn't have to be, social workers, counselors, or in my favorite example, it's any person who has firsthand knowledge of the improvement that the animal brings to the person's life, right? There's one example of a retired military veteran who adopted his also retired military animal, and his platoon buddies actually all wrote letters to the landlord to verify that our friend has so much trouble when he's not with his dog. For example, he can't keep his days and nights, can't have a regular schedule, doesn't like to leave his house. But by having his dog, his life is vastly improved and he has better enjoyment of his home and his surroundings. Next slide, please. And Ray, I don't know if you want me to handle this or if you want to take on national origin and the differences or the layers it might include, federal versus city.
Well, on the federal level, I know that it's national origin, like as I stated before in my earlier example, that's your place of birth. That's actually where you were born at. So that makes you a citizen of that country. Whereas I know ancestry is a little bit different. That actually is a state level regulation. It's actually not even a federal one, but it is state level for the state of Pennsylvania. And ancestry is slightly different than national origin. I know the example we always use is the case that we actually had with a gentleman who was Somali, and he went to go live in an apartment, go rent it, and he was denied. And we actually investigated and tested it, and we came back scratching our heads, and we said the landlord is also Somali, and so is every tenant in that building. So how in the world they discriminate against you? And he's like, oh, I should have explained. He's like, I'm actually Bantu Somali. He's like, so that's actually a tribal thing. When you're actually Bantu in Somalia, it's actually derogatory. It's a pejorative term. And so they were discriminating based on that, based on his ancestry. And so we, of course, took up that case. We won that case. He didn't move into that place. Reason he moved in, he had friends in the building, and he said it smelled like home from when everybody was cooking their foods and their meals. And so he actually wanted to be there, even though the landlord didn't necessarily like him because he was Bantu Somali. So that's my example for ancestry. Do you have something different that may be more for the city?
Sure. So for the city, place of birth for us, we've actually had cases where someone filed on place of birth, not just country of origin, but state of origin, i.e. they thought they were treated differently because they were a non-native Pennsylvanian. So place of birth can be a smaller locale in the city than it may be at the federal level. Ancestry is what we very often in Pittsburgh would think of as our ethnic background. For example, my mother's family came from Italy, so I still refer to myself as Italian or see myself as having Italian ancestry. Preferred language, if you come from a multilingual home and speak something other than English, that may be a perceived language issue, even if it's not related to ancestry or place of birth. Citizenship status includes immigration status, being undocumented, or being a US citizen. The interesting thing about citizenship status, we have seen cases where landlords attempted to, again, seemingly neutral, anyone without a social security number had to pay additional security deposit. So with that additional security deposit, you disproportionately impacted those that might have a citizenship status other than natural born citizen or naturalized citizen. Next slide, please. When it comes to COVID-19, for national origin discrimination, we have seen an uptick of discrimination against Asian and Pacific Islander folks, either by descent, preferred language, or ancestry. Those perceived identities and status are subjecting them to different treatment, and in particular, violence and harassment. And that disparate treatment is discriminatory. We know that while COVID may have originated in China, it is not Chinese people, it is not Asian people that bring about that disease. And so it's very important that when you're dealing with people to check your own biases and think, why am I treating this person this way if it's outside of how you would normally treat a person? Next slide, please. Ooh, language access. So what I love about language access is we actually have local resources. And at this point, if you're okay, Mary Jane, I'd like to turn it over to you because you're the expert.
Sure, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here today. I want to share with any landlords who are in attendance that I actually grew up in a small apartment building, and my dad was the maintenance guy. So he was the one who would walk around and, let people in if they lost their keys, unclog drains, just kind of be there to talk to everybody. So I understand better than a lot of people what it's like to rent an apartment to diverse populations. The building I grew up on was on 5th and Negley, so right in the middle of grad students from all over the world and people from Pittsburgh. And I understand the challenges of being a landlord, as well as the challenges of language access. I myself am a trained Spanish translator interpreter. I lived abroad for about 6 years. And for a couple of those years, I did not speak the language. So I kind of get both perspectives. And my expertise is in language accessibility. And I just want to share with you today, some things about, why language access is so important, what it even means to be language accessible, which resources are available to you, and what the cost for those is, because I know that cost is a big concern for a lot of people, and kind of when it's appropriate to use some of the different resources that are available to you. I also want to talk a little bit about the legal basis for language accessibility. And I also want to clarify this concept of preferred language when it comes to protected classes. So I'll start with preferred language. I think that it's easy to hear the term preferred language and to equate that with meaning that somebody may speak English as well as another language, but prefer to use the other language. But really what this is saying is that somebody may speak some English, somebody may speak a lot of English, or somebody may speak no English, but that regardless of which of those categories somebody falls into, the bottom line is that even if your second language skills are really strong, if you're stressed, if you're ill, if you're aging, if you're, you know, under any kind of, you know, sort of circumstances that could really affect your ability to process language, whether you speak English well or not, there's a really good chance that you're not going to understand all of the information that is shared with you, right? And that can impact landlords, neighbors, property owners, as well as the tenant, him or herself, right? Because if somebody doesn't understand how to report unsafe conditions, or how to report bed bugs, or how to report a broken window, that's eventually going to, you know, turn into a more expensive and more difficult problem for everybody, right? Not just for them. And so keep in mind when we say preferred language, this isn't just a matter of somebody would rather use their home language. It often means that their English is simply not sufficient to process the information that's being given to them, right? And so that kind of really dovetails nicely into what is language access. And I'm not going to take too much of this presentation's time, but this is a very important topic that is often kind of an afterthought for people, because the diversity that we're seeing in Pittsburgh is kind of new, right? I mean, even in the last 5 years, we've just started to see so many speakers of other languages in so many different neighborhoods where these populations did not exist before. And actually, according to Migration Policy Institute, the rate of growth for the emergent English proficient population in the United States is 80%, which means that this problem of language access is only going to continue to compound and to grow as we move forward in time here. So we're seeing this a lot more. And I always like to approach this from the position of, when you really think about it, people who do have limited or emerging English proficiency have troubles with language barriers in just about every aspect of their daily lives. Going to the bank, taking public transportation, enrolling in classes or enrolling their children in school, communicating with their children's teachers, understanding report cards, making appointments with doctors, going to doctor's visits, you know, understanding mail, finding an apartment, signing a lease, understanding the lease, reporting unsafe conditions, interacting with public safety and public health officials and resources, using libraries, you know, trying to get utilities connected, or interact with just about any service or resource or piece of information that's out there. And so they're exhausted by the time they get to you, right? Emergent English proficient individuals report high rates of depression. They use words in surveys to describe their experiences with all of those services as frustrating, ostracizing, as feeling other, as being made to feel stupid, as not being able to participate, as being sort of not a part of society, right? Not integrated. And when you consider that somebody has to work, you know, so much harder to connect with all of those services than a native English speaker would, and apply that to your service, which is, you know, being a landlord, keep in mind that they struggle with this constantly, and they're tired, and they're much less likely to reach out to report those unsafe conditions or to ask questions about their lease, and that there's a really high chance that they don't understand a lot of the information that you're giving to them. So try to come at it from a place of empathy, whereas it may be frustrating for us when people don't understand or when it's difficult to talk to them on the phone, it's so much more difficult for them. And it's a pervasive problem that affects almost every part of their lives. So, you know, that is what language access is, right? That's what language access means to people. It's a massive barrier that really holds people back and prevents people from integrating appropriately. In addition to being this huge ethical conundrum, language access is also the law. Most people don't realize that any entity that receives any amount of federal funding, right? That could be Section 8, that could be grant funding, that could even be, you know, any kind of loan on the property itself that has federal funding involved, is required under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide language accessibility and to make every effort to provide meaningful access to, you know, the services and information and resources. So there are a few other laws as well. Executive Order 13166, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And there are some provisions in Title II or Section 2 of the Americans with Disabilities Act as well that cover language access. There's a lot of case law and legal basis that has held up over time. And unfortunately, lawsuits have started to crop up all over the country. So this is something that is emerging as this population grows and something that you want to have on your radar from a legal perspective as well as a moral and ethical perspective. But to get into some practical information that can actually help you with this problem, I think one of the things that prevents people from becoming language accessible is often, you know, one, it feels really difficult and overwhelming to try to figure out how to deal with it, how to get an interpreter, how to have things translated, and also that there's a cost associated with the services, right? I think that is a really intimidating thing. And so I'll share some information with you now, which is just that translating something like a lease, you know, we'll say maybe that lease has 500 to 3,000 words in it, will probably cost you somewhere around $1,000, right, to have it done professionally. But that's going to save you so much work and frustration in the long run, right? We talk about language access a lot in terms of preventative versus reactive healthcare, right? If you're getting regular mammograms, that's a lot cheaper than it is to cover the cost of treatment for breast cancer, right? It's the same thing in these smaller situations where putting the money into having a lease translated makes it clear to people what the policies are, makes it clear to people, you know, how to manage the thermostat and how to report conditions, and that in the long run is going to be so worth it. So there's some financial motivation there as well, and I would recommend having leases and information that has to do with a lease and important notices translated by professionals. But I also wanted to share, you know, in terms of translation, it is okay to sometimes use Google Translate. So Google Translate is not appropriate to use for vital information such as a lease, such as safety or public health concerns, but it's perfectly okay to use Google Translate to translate a letter that, you know, just says, hey, could you give us a call? Or to inform somebody, hey, next week we're gonna have to cut the water off for an hour while it's serviced, right? It's perfectly okay to use those free resources for non-vital communication like that. And as Rita said, there are tons of resources in the city of Pittsburgh for where you can have things translated by professionals. So I think that taking some time to learn about the linguistic communities in the geographical areas where your properties are and to have things translated into those languages is a very important step. Some other things and ways you can make yourself accessible are by using oral interpreters. And this can be done over the phone, via video, or in person. And there are lots of resources for this also. My company, of course, provides translation, interpretation, and you know, all of these services, but there are many others in Pittsburgh who are also great and do a great job. And I'm sure anybody at the Housing Authority can guide you to one of those resources. Live interpretation and phone interpretation can be a little bit on the pricey side, depending on the situation. Most in-person interpreters will have a 2-hour minimum and be anywhere from $50 to $75 an hour, or more if it's, you know, simultaneous or if there's technical content. Telephonic interpretation, the quality is not as good, but the price is lower. It's anywhere from $1 to $2 a minute typically. And you can contract with an on-demand service where you just call a number and dial a PIN and you'll get a live interpreter on the phone. Like I said, the quality of those interpreters is not great. Most of them are independent contractors who are paid very little for their time. And so there's high turnover and they tend not to be very well trained. But for non-essential information, it's a great resource and a great tool. And so I think it's important as a landlord to have a toolbox full of resources such as translated leases and documentation, a contract with or a way to reach an on-demand interpreter service, a source for in-person interpreters if ever you need one for like a meeting or to show an apartment to somebody. And then, you know, just being aware always of what the linguistic communities are in the geographic areas where your properties are located is really important. I think this is such a big topic. You know, I could spend hours and hours and hours talking to you all about it, but to keep it under just, you know, enough time so that, you know, you can absorb all of the information in this presentation, I'm going to kind of pass it now back to Rita. But, you know, if anybody does ever have questions about language accessibility or would like to have resources, I'm always available to share and to answer questions. So that's what I've got for now. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Jane. And again, I think it's so important to recognize that there are resources available. And because this can be a cost for landlords, it's important to consult with your tax professionals to determine if any of these might be write-offs against either losses, other tax liability, or profits. So just because something might be a cost for landlords, it may be better to consider it an investment for the long run. For example, if you know that you have had clients in the past or potential clients in the past that speak something other than English and you have written materials already prepared, that ounce of preparedness is worth a pound of emergency treatment. But moving on, we can go into a little bit more about citizenship status protections. This includes threats and harassment, such as calling ICE or other federal agencies. And to be very clear, in addition to citizenship status or any protected class, we also have a protected class of retaliation. That is, if someone reports or complies or works with us as the commission, and then they are mistreated in their housing, that triggers a protection for them as well and could be additional complaints. And again, when making policies, be mindful of the impact it will have across populations. So having different deposit amounts for those with Social Security numbers or those without, that's a disparate impact. Not treating people the same is disparate treatment. So again, being even keeled in rule application and policy application is our best advice to avoid liability and investigation with us. And if you ever have any questions about your policies as they may apply to any protected class, please come to the commission. We're happy to help. Next slide, please. So to engage a little bit here, I want you to think of the following example. Sophia is a Spanish-speaking woman from Peru who is looking for a home with her 3 children. Her realtor suggests that she should be looking for homes in Beachview, but she wouldn't want to look for homes in Shadyside because Sophia may not be able to read many of the store signs. This makes Sophia feel uneasy, but she's unsure if it's discrimination. This is a case where someone may come to us, and this is a very real life example for our commission. In that case, as an investigator, I would look and see, did the realtor make those suggestions? And if true, why did she make them for reasons other than the obvious, which is language preference? So having people housed by ethnicity or by protected class or by language, while it may seem caring, is actually inappropriate and robs individuals of their choice in homes. And that's what fair housing is. It's a freedom of choice. And one's identity should not be a limitation on that choice. Next slide, please. So switching protected classes, we're going to take it to survivors of domestic violence. And this is where I would ask Adrian to jump in and explain, because again, you are the expert, I'm just enforcement.
Sure. And thank you for having the Women's Center. And I just want to highlight the work that Global Wordsmiths has done in the community with language access. They've helped us here at Women's Center with our real team and all of our staff. Our real team is our refugees, immigrants, and limited English proficiency. So I just want to, highlight their work, and also just kind of touch on what Mary Jane said about having that language access, which we have through our real team, but also for all of our staff through, we use telephonic interpretation with Globo. So that's something that we use, on our hotline, so we can talk to survivors immediately if their English is not their first language. And we also use that for other programs in our agency. I also wanted to say that I work with our shelter and our on-site services, but we at the Women's Center provide lots of services through the courts, our legal advocacy program. We have a civil law project, immediate needs coordinator. We have a CYF team. We have non-resident counseling services. We have services for children. So we really have a wide range of services to meet survivor needs. But again, specifically, I work with residents in our emergency shelter, and we serve approximately, I would say, around 400 to 500 adult residents per year and children. And then we also have a rapid rehousing program that started, we're going into our third year, and it's the acronym for the program is DV UP, and it's the Domestic Violence Unified Project, and it's the Women's Center and Shelter along with Crisis Center North and the Hope Center. So in that program in the last year, we served 150 households, so both women and children. So, as the slide reads, a survivor of domestic violence is someone who's experienced violence in their home from another member of their household or person with frequent access to their home. So it's not connected to age or to sex, and can include stalking, harassment, or other unwanted behaviors. In particular with our rapid rehousing program, and with our shelter residents as well, whether they are enrolled in our rapid rehousing program or another program through the Allegheny County Link, we have most of our residents searching for safe, affordable housing. So we, oftentimes they are reaching out to landlords, and they've experienced barriers directly related to the intimate partner violence that they've experienced. So we've had lots of residents that have criminal and poor credit history, and that's directly linked to their abuser. Credit history can be related to things that they haven't had control over, because of course with domestic violence, we know it's about power and control, and oftentimes residents have or survivors, their abusers have had complete and total financial control over them, and even access to their social security numbers, which has led to, poor credit history, utility bills, that sort of thing. And same with the criminal records. Oftentimes it's directly tied to the domestic violence, whether it's, they had abusers that were engaging in illegal activity in their homes, or they've been forced into, criminal behavior because of the domestic violence. So that oftentimes, residents or survivors face those barriers, and what, we're tasked with is the advocacy that happens with landlords to kind of help them explain those things and kind of work with them through that process. Fortunately, with the rapid rehousing program, it's a self-sufficiency program, and we're able to provide rental assistance up to a year, and case management services. So we're a lot of supportive services for survivors while they're living in housing. So they're connected with us, but they're living independently. And as the slide reads, a lot of times landlords, they're looking for a housing history, so they're not recognizing shelters as a housing history. They're refusing reasonable accommodations. Again, this kind of ties into the barriers holding the victim responsible, when sometimes it's not. The barriers that they have are their fault and have some backstory to them. Keeping survivors safe, always, respecting confidentiality and not requiring documentation of the domestic violence, whether that's, PFA or police reports and that sort of thing. So we know that with domestic violence, power and control and isolation is a really big tactic, and it has been increased, the increased use of isolation during the pandemic by abusers. So it's created a lot of limitation of movement for those experiencing violence. And we know that there was a decrease in reporting in the pandemic, but we know that definitely there was an increase in violence. And speaking of Women's Center in particular, we, during the early months of the pandemic, we created, it was already in our strategic plan to create a text chat program, so a platform where survivors could reach us not via phone, but on text or chat. And we had a plan to have that created by September, but we realized with the onset of the pandemic, we kind of worked diligently to get that started. We started that in May of last year, and that's been a way for survivors to connect, because they've been in that isolation and they have no access to phone or to call us or at any point, and they can text or chat, which has been incredibly helpful, I think. So what would be helpful is accommodating the trauma response, recognizing cultural differences, recognizing individual differences, and safety planning. And we do that a lot with, every survivor that we work with. We have a 24-hour hotline that's listed, the text chat line that is listed as well. And, if landlords can always reach out and ask questions too, they can call our 24-hour hotline. If they're working particularly or with a survivor, oftentimes they're connected with a staff person here. So that staff person can help advocate for that survivor. Or if there's just a question that you may have, you could visit our website to look for resources or call our 24-hour hotline. We just encourage, you to reach out with questions so that we can kind of help, support you and support our survivors as they move through the housing process.
And for the sake of time, I am going to ask that we skip the slide itself where it has the housing example. Okay. But again, the most important thing, Adrian, is, and which Adrian has highlighted, is that empathy, recognition, and being gentle and kind with the people you deal with is not only a good practice for you as a person, but a good practice for your business model. And again, mitigation and avoidance of liability. In the last couple of minutes, I want to touch on the Crown Act, but first I do want to thank you, Adrian, so much for taking the time out today and explaining this to people, that very often people may not come forward out of fear. But once the situation is known, to be accommodating and as accommodating as possible. For the Crown Act specifically covers hair, hairstyle, use of extensions, adornments, ornamentations, which includes wraps, turbans, and other decor. It can overlap with protected classes of national origin, ancestry, religion, or place of birth. Next slide, please. So some basic do's and don'ts. If you have a hairstyle policy for your tenants, you should probably eliminate it. You should recognize that hair texture or hairstyle, including use of extension or ornaments or head wraps, is not indicative of a tenant's worthiness, a buyer's worthiness, a mortgager's worthiness, or a borrower's worthiness. You should apply policies equally to all persons. Again, provide uniform services to all persons and utilize the Pittsburgh Commission's policy for review. We're happy to do that for you, especially if you have some overriding safety need that there must be a hair policy. Some don'ts: don't refuse to sell, lease, sublease, or rent, or otherwise assign or transfer title to a person because of their hair or because of their hairstyle. Do not discriminate in providing facilities or services for any dwelling because of hairstyle. Do not use forms which indicate a preference for or limitation on hairstyles. Do not induce directly or indirectly sale or rental based on assertions that people with certain hairstyles are moving in. That is typically referred to as blockbusting and redlining. But again, we have seen stranger things. With that, I know we're a couple minutes over, but I still would like for anyone to present their questions. They can either drop them in the chat or message the panelists. And for all panelists and attendees, I'm including the HUD resources for fair housing and assistance animals and the document that is a HUD and DOJ, Department of Justice, joint statement on service and support animals. Are there any questions? Well, that's great, panelists. We've explained it all. We've explained fair housing in an hour. Well, I don't know if you want to go back, Adrian, since now we've gone through everything. If you want to go back to our example for domestic violence.
Yeah, if you think that would be helpful, sure.
Sure, we could do that briefly. So Amelia has been staying with relatives and most recently in a women's shelter due to having a PFA, or protection from abuse order, against her previous partner. She views an apartment, fills out an application, and pays a security deposit. Weeks later, her advocate at the shelter gets a call stating that the landlord has reconsidered because they aren't comfortable having a tenant whose partner could pose a safety threat to others. I can tell you as an investigator, again, that is a situation where a person is being treated differently, specifically because of their protected class. And Adrian, if you could tell us how many times you've seen this or other variations you have seen.
Yeah, so we've definitely seen this, and the other variation would be that even before, landlord would rent to one of our survivors, they expressed this concern. So, we're tasked with the advocacy piece and letting, landlords know, that it is housing discrimination, and also, that we are connected with them and we're supporting them. And the PFA does provide protection for them. But again, it's, that's just a piece of it that, the bottom line, it is discrimination, and that's not something that, a landlord can, say to prospective tenant or somebody that is already in a lease. Oftentimes, though, it is when we're advocating with landlords, we've had really, established really great relationships with landlords, and they've been, understanding. And sometimes that, the either, the PFA on top of, the advocacy that they're receiving from Women's Center sometimes kind of assures the landlord that, that the tenant has our survivor has the support. But again, it should really not be an issue. But we've been able to, form, partnerships with landlords, especially through our rapid rehousing program. So they've been able to understand the need of survivors and kind of work with them, or the needs of survivors.
So I see a question in the chat. What should a landlord do if they have a tenant who has a person constantly coming onto the property to pound on the door, threaten them, or stalk them? Stalking is also covered under our domestic violence provision. My advice as commission representative and investigator would be to address the situation. Do not ignore it. Do not issue lease violations. Again, engage with your tenant. If it's a stalker, maybe it's a situation where you as the landlord also need to call the police because your property rights are being violated, in addition to someone having their personal freedom being limited. And I don't know if you have additional advice on that, Adrian.
Yeah, so I, definitely what you said, and also, with addressing the situation, what support does that tenant need? This is oftentimes unwanted and unsolicited, and this the tenants could be in danger, their life could be in danger. So really, what support do they need? Of course, the Women's Center is a good resource for that. So whether as a landlord, you pass along that information to help them, identify, resources and safety planning and support, that would be helpful, as well as, what you mentioned, Rita, if they're in a position where they have to reach out to the police to let them know that their property rights are being violated. But again, to, address the situation and kind of look at it as that this person, this tenant needs support. So how can we do that, and how can you kind of get that tenant support, and also protect the property and that sort of thing.
Again, very often we see that protecting the least of us, or those who are disadvantaged, or those who are otherwise marginalized, continues to protect all of us. And so that would be one of my parting thoughts. And I see another question. What if a landlord cannot afford the requested accommodation or modification? That's an excellent question. So if you are a federal housing provider or a federally funded housing provider, you have to provide the modification, which is a change to the physical structure of the building, or the accommodation. And HUD has funding available to help with that request. If you are a private landlord and a modification has been requested, the tenant or the requester can be made to pay for the modification. Again, you have to allow it. It's a modification. Supposed devaluation of the property is not a reason to deny the modification. I can tell you that we've seen that complaint, and I'm sure FHP has too. Another situation may be, say there is an unreasonable accommodation, right? So every request isn't necessarily reasonable. And this is why we engage in the interactive process. If, for example, the accommodation is costly, and the landlord can show that it is an undue burden, that would be a reason to deny. However, if you're denying the accommodation as requested, it is still advised as a best practice to negotiate some other alternative. So just because someone asks doesn't mean it's the accommodation that must be granted. It's obviously the preferred accommodation to be granted if possible. But if it is an undue burden, either administratively or financially, then it may be a reason for denial, but in no circumstances is it a reason to stop negotiating or stop the interactive process. And again, I want to take the time to thank everyone. And if our panelists have parting thoughts, the mic is open for you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very happy to have everyone, and I thank everyone. And hopefully this can be a continuing conversation and recognizing that landlords can be partners in promoting fair housing in private capacities as well as public sector capacities. So, oh, and I would be remiss if I did not thank Heather for following along with my big mouth. And who's done a wonderful job in interpretation. And hopefully that's an example that we can set for more language access. So thank you very, very much, everyone. And with that, I think we can end this presentation.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you.